Cronos The New Dawn has dropped, and it's a game that I've actually been really looking forward to, so I was very curious to see how it would run on the PC. Now, I decided to test this with a combination of minimum and recommended system requirements and a few higher end PC configurations as well. Now, before we begin, I just want to disclose that I was sent this code for the purposes of coverage, but of course, all opinions are my own. I still think it's very important to disclose that I was sent a review copy, but here we are. Now, I wanted to begin with a GTX 1080 because it's under the minimum system requirements. Now, the question is, how well does it perform? To make things simple, I also wanted to pare back my CPU a little bit, so I took the 10900K and disabled 4 of the CPU cores, leaving 6 cores and 12 threads. The minimum system requirement is actually an 8600K, which would only be 6 cores, 6 threads. But I wanted to test out the lower end CPU configuration further in just a moment. But let's focus on the 1080. Fortunately, the good news is it does offer enough performance to run at 1080p, but you're certainly going to need to make some compromises on visual setting. The differences between low and very low is gigantic, in visual quality as well as frame rate. At 1080p, you would probably need to use some type of upscaling if you wanted to use the low setting. Now, DLSS is not available with the GTX 1080, of course, but the good news is you still have FSR 3.1, TSR, and Intel's XeSS. I'll use a few different settings in the video, and you guys can make a decision based on the comparison. I would recommend you just try out different things and figure out what you want. TSR, even on the lower quality setting, looks okay, but it's also going to depend on the distance you're viewing the screen and just how sensitive you are to this stuff. Now, what about the RTX 3080? This actually falls under the recommended system requirements for the GPU. I took the 10900K and now we have all of the cores, all of the threads available. And, well, if you're planning on playing this in native 4K, good luck, because even without ray tracing, let's just say it's very heavy. At high quality without RT and any upscaling at all, you'll regularly dip under 30 FPS just at the very beginning of the game. Believe me, it goes downhill real fast from there. For my money, if you want to play at 4K, you're almost certainly going to want to turn on DLSS. Performance looks good enough for me, upscaling from 1080p internally, but do note, of course, you will certainly not be sticking to 60 FPS. You could go with DLSS Ultra Performance or reduce some of the quality settings a smidgen, but I also decided, rather than just going with high, I would also test out the Epic preset as well, again without ray tracing enabled. And performance is absolutely, well, yeah, it dips in even the quietest sections to mid-40s. So Epic is probably out of the picture here. I would recommend high and DLSS either performance or ultra performance, or perhaps going with a slightly different setting, maybe slightly lower than high. Again, this is all of course going to be based upon your decision. What about if you have a 1440p display? Well, the good news is, of course, there are way fewer pixels for the 3080 to drive, and therefore you get much higher performance. You could even probably enable ray tracing if you're willing to deal with some performance issues. So with RT off and DLSS quality in the Epic preset, performance is going to be between 50 and 70 FPS. If you opted to go with DLSS balanced or mess around with the Epic setting and perhaps go with more high, you're certainly going to be hitting 60 FPS almost all the times, at least in the early section of the game that I've been testing. For ray tracing though, there's no levels of RT. It's yes or no. That's it. For the 3080 at 1440p, you'll want to hit minimum of DLSS performance. And then you're probably still going to notice frame rates under 50 when things get really busy. If you switch from Epic preset to high, or you're more liberal with DLSS, in other words, ultra performance, then you're probably going to be a lot more consistent in the frame rates and get over 60. But then you're asking, well, do I really want to make a much worse image quality with the scaling versus just disabling ray tracing? And again, of course, that's a decision I'm going to leave to you guys. Now, before I move from the 3080, remember how I said I wanted to test a lower end CPU configuration? Well, if you recall, the lowest end system configuration it recommends for the CPU is an 8600K, or at least one of the options. I don't have one of these to hand. I technically have an 8700K, but it still wouldn't fit the needs, so I decided to poke things a little further in the 10900K's BIOS. This time I disabled hyperthreading, SMT, so now we're left with just 6 cores and the same number of threads. Now, to point out the obvious, it's not still 100% mirroring an 8600K. For a start, there's more L3 cache, the clock frequencies are a little higher than an 8600K would hit at stock, but you could overclock that, so let's just go with it, shall we? I wanted to force as much work onto the CPU as possible, so with the 3080 I'm running ray tracing disabled, 1440p, DLSS set to ultra performance, and the in-game settings at epic. Generally speaking, the CPU is just getting beaten with a stick, but it does hold firm generally speaking and would keep our RTX 3080 fairly busy. With that said, it does dip. And when you start entering new areas or you start hitting busier sections, you can certainly start noticing frame rates hit quite hard actually. Now, if I tested the CPU configuration with a GTX 1080, which would be basically the minimum system requirements, I think some of these problems would have been masked because obviously the 1080 would be holding things back a little more. But ultimately, for those running a lower end GPU, things can dip a little more, but I would still say an 8600K would probably serve you okay with this game, but I would certainly shy away from the epic setting and I would probably nudge it down just a little bit. Now let's jump to a higher end system. This is an Intel 14900K and RTX 5070. Again, to give you guys a disclosure, this is a system sent to me by CyberPower. I'm actually in the process of setting this up right now and testing it out. So I figured I would make double use of it because I don't actually own my own RTX 5070. So hey, guess what? Anyway, the 5070 I decided to opt with 1440p and 4K testing. Although honestly 4K is a little optimistic. With 1440p, ray tracing is technically within reach. Generally, balanced hovers at 60 FPS with the epic graphics settings in quieter areas, but when shifting to inside buildings and lots of lights and shadows, frame rate starts to get really hit. I'd probably recommend, if you want ray tracing, to go with DLSS performance or ditching RT entirely and going with RT quality. Now, depending on your tolerances and preferences, you might be able to help things be a little smoother with multi-frame generation, but personally I think frame rates of over 60 are best with MFG, so I would personally recommend to aim for that first. I'm using the latest transformer model for DLSS, using of course the Nvidia app to override, and setting DLSS Ultra Performance, Ray Tracing enabled, Epic preset and 1440p. Performance is much better, nudging up to 100 FPS. With that said, there is certainly some image softness and some breakup with ray tracing details that you can notice, particularly at certain camera angles, so that's up to you. I would probably say the performance mode would be the better way to go, but even so, I thought I'd show this off just for the sake of it. With RT off and aiming for 4K, the game is super demanding for a 5070. Of course, there's a card which is more aimed at 1440p displays, so it's not too surprising, but with the Epic preset and DLSS performance, you can certainly hit mid-40s at worst, but with 1440p and ray tracing disabled and DLSS quality, you can hit well over 80. Okay, so what about a very powerful system? Cronos is now running on a 5090 paired with a Ryzen 9 9950X 3D and 48GB of memory running at 7400 MTS. Now, clearly, I don't think it's worth running 1440p on this system. 4K is clearly the target of someone who's building a system like this, and so there's both good and bad news. If you're choosing to run with ray tracing, then you're going to be reasonably good to go, but you will need to leverage DLSS, quality setting at the very least, and then you're still going to hit drops of performance and a little hitching. I had noticed that there's more stuttering with RT on than RT off. Maybe that's just my particular experience or configuration. We'll have to wait and see as more people cover the game. Regardless, I had my best luck actually with an experience with DLSS set to balanced and frame generation 2x. Now, they may be fake frames, but they do help to offset slight dips in motion when it comes to just, the visual quality. And so I think setting DLSS to balance, we're maintaining a high enough frame rate where input latency is fine, because Cronos is not a fast twitch-paced shooter. Now again, this is my personal preference. You guys may decide to go with something entirely different, such as disabling ray tracing and going with a different DLSS quality setting. I will note though that occasionally for me there were hitches when entering new areas, even with the 5090. You can think of it as like loading checkpoints. Now they did only last a couple of seconds, and then frame rates returned to normal, but I would understand folks being annoyed by this, even though for me anyway, and I want to stress I haven't gotten super far into the game because I didn't want to just show areas that are super far and then X as spoilers, but from where I've seen these mostly hit so far, the loading screens, it typically seems to be quieter areas. With that said, as I mentioned a moment ago, when you start pushing ray tracing enabled, you will start to see the odd bit of stutter, at least in the configurations that I've personally tried out, and this was a lot more prevalent on the 3080. Maybe that's got something to do with VRAM as well, I'm not 100% certain. With that said guys, this has just been a quick test, so I haven't been on camera for this one because I'm still trying to figure out the format a little bit. Let me know your thoughts and opinions, and obviously if you're not subscribed to the channel and you like this type of content, definitely do subscribe. But yeah, some feedback would be nice. This is kind of like a proof of concept video, but with that said, take care of yourselves, have an amazing day, bye for now.